everyone. I feel like I've had the pleasure to meet about half of you so far, so the other half I'm happy to stick around afterwards to meet you as well. I'm from the U.S. Department of Education. I work in the Office of the Secretary in the Office of Educational Technology, and we are an EdTech policy shop for the rest of the department, and that's very exciting. So anything that touches on technology, specifically educational technology across the department, we're there to support, to help, to think about. We're awesome at bringing people together, especially from diverse groups. So that's one of the reasons why we love to attend Games for Change, because that's exactly, what this is. People from all sorts of backgrounds coming together to talk about important topics. And we're also awesome at amplifying good work that's already out there and existing. So one of the things that I just wanted to talk about briefly to kick things off is you'll see up here, we have our National Educational Technology Plan. That is something that we publish every 5 years. We just came out with the newest one in December. And you can see we have a specific section on assessment. You'll see the traditional, this is just the infographic, but you'll see the traditional versus next generation. Now that applies to all digital assessments, but we believe that games can be a form of digital assessment. So some of these topics you'll, I'm sure, hear about from our panelists as well today. The ability to embed assessments, to design for people people with accessibility needs, the ability to create adaptive assessments, to get real-time feedback, and to enhance your item types. So there's a lot to be deconstructed here. We'll try to, we're going to start off with some introductions so that you know the folks who are here, and then we'll get into some questions, conversations, really, and then we'll open it up for questions at the end as well. One of our panelists is running late. John from Strange Loop, who's doing the eco game that some of you I'm sure have seen already. When he comes in the back, if you could just point and like jeer at him as he walks up, that'll make him feel really bad, and so that'll be good. So otherwise, we have Kristen DiCerbo here and Abby Speight. So let each of them come up here and introduce themselves, and I'll pull up their slides.
Thanks. So good morning. My name is Kristen Desilva. I lead education research at Pearson. So you might think about us as, what are they doing here? Traditional publisher and lots of talk about, high stakes tests. But what I do is actually research and thinking about how we can really change the things we're doing based on all of our movement into the digital world. So a couple things that I've worked on just as introduction. When you hear Glass Lab, who was part of the conversation last night talking about when they were founded, it was a combination of a whole bunch of groups, including Pearson. That was basically me. So I was worked with them on the SimCity EDU and Mars Generation 1 projects. And then recently have been involved in something we call the Insight Learning System, which is a research project where we tried to design not just a game, but an entire system around thinking about a game combined with classroom activity, combined with some other online performance assessments, a couple traditional assessments, and professional development, all around teaching students the concept of area. So like third grade students, how do they develop the concept of area? So those are just some things to kind of introduce you. But I wanted to really talk about the kinds of research that I think are important for really moving us forward in terms of formative assessment. So I'm going to walk through what each of these pictures signifies a little bit. On the top left, you'll see what is one of our depictions of a learning progression. And we feel like before we start thinking about assessing where a student is, we need to have a theory of how they learn on a given topic. How do they move from being a novice to eventually being an expert? Are there stages that they go through? How do we define those? So for instance, in this topic of geometric measurement of area, it turns out that it's not just about memorizing the formula, area equals length times width. It's about thinking, how do students come to understand that what that number tells you is the number of square units that fill a space? So there are stages, things like that the math education experts call area unit iteration, where you place individual square units side by side in a non-overlapping way in order to fill a space. And then you get the idea, oh, if I count those units, that actually is the area. And oh, that formula is just a simple way to get to that number. So each of those is a stage in the progression that students can walk through. And so if we're thinking about designing learning or assessment in games, we want to be thinking about what are those levels that students move through. So there's a lot of research that needs to be done just about having students completing tasks, observing them, doing think aloud protocols, so we can understand what those stages are. The next piece, how do we design tasks that then align to those pieces and give us information about what level we think a student is at? What would students who've mastered that idea of area unit iteration do on this task? And what would students who haven't mastered it? And how do we design a task that differentiates between those two groups? The next piece is kind of this whole mess on the bottom, right? We get these huge log files out. How do we then pull out the pieces that really give us evidence of what a student is thinking? How do we pull out that information so we can think about, and when we think about traditional assessments, we think about items. But instead of items here, we really have these big activities that can produce evidence. So from there, we can think about, all right, what do we need to do to be able to pull those together? Up at the top is actually thinking about statistical models. That sounds fun, right? How do we think about, in traditional assessments, we can do a couple things. One, a lot of teachers do what we call add them up, right? How many questions, how many items did you get correct? And that's your score. What percent did you get correct? But that actually doesn't help us if we're thinking we want to know where a student is on a learning progression. We can't just kind of open up their heads and see. So it's really, what we're talking about is probabilistic models, models that tell us the probability that a student has mastered it. We're not going to be totally sure, but we want to think about where those fit in. But the problem is a lot of our traditional assessment models are based on the idea of correct and incorrect, whereas we're talking about pieces of evidence like, how long did this take you? We're talking about, did you do A, B, and C, or B, C, and A? What was the order you did these in? Which strategy did you use to solve this problem? How do you put those and combine those in a statistical model that ends up telling you the likelihood that someone has mastered something? So those are the kinds of things that we're working on that piece of things. And then finally at the bottom, how do we communicate all of this in a way that teachers understand? If we think, and as I do, that formative assessment is really about decision support. How do we support teachers and students and parents in making decisions about what students should do next to meet their goals? If that's what we're doing, how do we communicate this information to them in a way that then helps them think about what they should do next, make those decisions? How should I group my students for this lesson? What students need a little more individual attention about a certain thing? What should I review with my whole class? So how do we communicate to help them make decisions as opposed to just telling them a score or telling them where students are? So that's a whole other line of research, is thinking about student decision-making and our teacher decision-making and the communication tools that we can use to help them do that. So that's just kind of a brief look into some of the things that we're working on, and look forward to talking more about some of these during the panel. Thanks, James.
Hi, I'm Abby Speight. I'm the director of product for Zynga.org, and I'm here to talk to you guys today about a new game that we're getting ready to launch. We're really excited about it. It's our first venture into educational games, and it's a classroom version of Words with Friends. And we actually had the good fortune of working with Glass Lab on our assessment and learning design for that as well, so there's a lot of overlap there. So I'm mainly going to take this time to give you a little bit of an overview of the game and the learning goals and how we thought about assessment there, so there's a good foundation for the discussion. Probably just go like that.
I'm so sorry.
No worries.
That's
I can
totally
try to
my.
give his
No,
probably
please
a
don't. I'm so sorry about that. Yours aren't here.
That's okay. I could probably just.
Okay, can you wing it?
Yeah.
Okay.
You guys are going to have
This is a,
really good imagination.
This is on me, for sure. You can just use this time to download Words with Friends, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
All right. So the basic idea behind Words with Friends EDU is how do we bring vocabulary learning into Words with Friends? We started out by talking to teachers, students, educators to really understand what did they see as the educational potential in the game. And what we heard loud and clear was this is a great tool to learn words and to underscore the importance of words that are going to help kids succeed in school. So Words with Friends EDU has a new educational feature set focused on incentivizing and rewarding the play of high-value academic words. So these are words that show up in textbooks, required reading, and assessments, words that essentially students need to know in order to be able to succeed in school. We worked with WestEd to develop a list of 800 high-value academic words that became a special class of words in the game called Power Words. So in Words with Friends EDU, you get bonus points if you play Power Words. Whenever you play a power word, you get a chance to earn more bonus points by choosing the best usage of the word in context. So we're trying to bring the meaning of the word into the game, which doesn't really exist in traditional Words with Friends. So students will see 3 different sentences that use the word, and one of the sentences will be correct. 2 of them will demonstrate sort of a common grammatical error with the word to try to make sure that they can really demonstrate their meaning. And then they get bonus points if they answer that correctly. We also wanted to bring in a hint system for 2 reasons. One, to accommodate students who might be struggling and not know what word to play on a given turn. And 2, also, again, to incentivize the play of those power words. So students can use a hint to see the definition of the highest scoring power word they can play on a turn. And that helps them guess which word to play next. It also, once again, brings the meaning of the word into the game. So that's basically the educational core loop of the game. We also added in a badge and avatar system to help make sure that it's fun and engaging for students. And then most relevant for this conversation, we added in a teacher dashboard powered by Glass Lab that includes a shout-out report that flags for teachers when students have completed actions that signal that they're learning in the game, a watch-out report when there are actions that signal that a student's struggling, and then a standards report that shows progression against Common Core standards. So the idea is that this dashboard, in combination with the game, can be a really powerful tool for teachers to tailor their instruction to students based on the learning they're demonstrating as they play. So that's pretty much it. Thank you.
All right, my name's been sitting up there for a while now. So my name's John Krajewski. I'm from Strange Loop Games. Our company is founded by people from the commercial games industry. So my background is I used to work at EA, I used to work at Midway. And so we're coming to the educational game space trying to connect those markets. And all the games we create are kind of targeted at both. Like we want it to stand alone on Steam or on the App Store as a regular game. So these are some of the games that we've made previously. We have Vessel. SimCell was a cell simulation game. You're playing this nanobot inside of a cell. We're developing a Mars colonization game. And Vessel was kind of our first game as an indie studio. And this is Codebreakers, which is a social algebra game. And our current project, the big one we're working on right now, is called ECO. This is funded by Department of Education. And the idea with ECO is you are building a civilization with your classroom. This is virtual world that you play with everybody in a single classroom. You share this world over the course of 30 days. And your goal is to build a civilization, but you need to do that inside of a simulated ecosystem. So all the resources you're using are coming from this ecosystem, and you can actually damage and destroy this world. So you have to band together, you have to create laws using the in-game government, and you propose and vote on laws, and you discuss them, and you use scientific data from the simulation. So the simulations are continuously generating data that you're able to use in your argument. So it's kind of scientific argumentation, debate, and leadership and collaboration, a lot of these 21st century skills in the context of ecology and statistics from these graphs, kind of connecting a number of different subjects. And one of the things we've thought a lot about is how does this fit into the classroom? What is the role of assessment in this? And we're basically it's not a game we see being used with classroom time. This is the kind of game that you play outside of the classroom or after school on your own device. It's kind of this digital field trip is how we like to think of it. It's just running alongside the classroom. And then inside the classroom, the teacher has this aggregate view of what's going on in this world. So they can see, for example, these two students are having this discussion about this law, or this is a challenge they're facing, or there's this big pollution problem over here. And that's kind of the council meeting time where they can discuss it and decide what to do based on this data. So not only are the students getting this data and using it to argue to their peers what should be done, but the teacher is getting a view of what the students are doing, what are the challenges they're facing, and they can use that for assessment, for kind of guiding these classroom discussions. And the idea is the game makes it incredibly easy for the teacher to just pull up a web page and like you have all the things that are happening in this world. You have an idea of, what kind of things you can talk about that have a real context for students right at that moment. And that's something that we think has a lot of potential, this idea of kind of an augmented classroom, this like digital world that belongs to the students, but the teachers have a view into. It just provides a lot of context to everything that's going on in the classroom. And that's what we're working on right now.
So, I'm really curious. How many people, can we do like a hand raising thing? Because it's Department of Education, so we need to do a hand raising thing. How many people here are teachers? Whoa, okay, so a lot of you. How many of you are developing or are in a company that is developing a game that is considering some sort of assessment component to it? Okay, that's like everybody else. Are there any like academic researchers who are just here for the fun of it? Okay, power to you. And is there anybody that was not included in those three groups? Okay, all right. Well, welcome anyways. All right, so that'll give you a little bit of an idea of what kind of an audience you're talking to here. You're all doing amazing things, awesome individual projects. I'd like to touch on a couple of broader themes so that we can help some of the people here who are in this room now who are either looking at using these things or who are looking at creating or studying their own. So sometimes I'll address a couple of questions to you specifically, but feel free, everybody, to jump in. So Kristen, I kind of wanted to start with you first. I was curious if you could maybe frame the conversation here. We get a lot of questions at the Department of Education that go something along the lines of this. People love game X. People hate the SAT. Is there some way to merge those two together and now everybody will love the SAT or whatever test you're talking about? So what is the state of game-based assessment right now? Where are we at? What can we do and what can't we do so well?
I think it is dangerous to think about game-based assessment in a high-stakes environment. I do not think we are in any way ready for your score in a game to determine whether you graduate from high school, whether you get into college, or any of those kinds of high-stakes decisions. We're still doing a lot of work around things like validity and reliability, and if you're going to make a game in a high-stakes world, you need to be really sure about those things. And we're not there yet with game-based assessment. And I don't know if that's a goal that we want to pursue, frankly. I think there's a lot of things attached, a lot of different purposes to assessment. And I think as we think about what games are good at, they're good at going deep into a topic. They're good at really getting students immersed in something. And that's not what a high-stakes assessment does. They're trying to cover a whole bunch of content really quickly. Like, I actually came here from the Council of Chief State School Officers assessment meeting, which is where all the people who lead assessment in all 50 states get together and talk about assessment. And they're saying, 4 hours is too much for an assessment. So I think and this is kind of my opinion, is that where we really need to be thinking about is the in-classroom formative assessment, where we're thinking about this becomes something that students can do and play as they're learning. So it's learning and assessment. We don't have to say, wait, stop, take a test. We get the information as they're learning. So I think that's the big promise of game-based assessment. Now, the other interesting question that I'd really like to figure out is, if we're collecting all this data over the course of the year, could we combine that in a way that actually gives us a better assessment than that 3-hour or 4-hour test at the end of the year does? That's an open question of whether that can happen or not. But I think it's up for debate.
John and Abby, I saw you both shaking your heads. Do you want to expand on that?
Yeah, I think that's very well said, and I agree that as soon as you make a game high stakes, like you ruin the game in a sense. Like part of the value of it is you have this chance to experiment and play, and like failure is really a part of games. You're constantly like, it's part of the process of learning, and once that's high stakes, it's a different situation. But the possibility for kind of this aggregate view, I think, is interesting as well. That's something that could emerge.
I think for us, having the discipline to really focus in on, start small on what we were trying to assess and what we were trying to underscore was important. And so it was really tempting to cast a wide net and to get really wide-eyed at all the possibilities for learning and assessment in the game, but to really rein in and focus in on one key goal to start was an important principle for us. And then also part of the value of just providing some excitement and some relevance to the learning. And so going into classrooms, and you could go into a classroom and ask the students, what's everybody's favorite power word? And they would be raising their hand and excited to share, like, oh, Axis is a great one because it scores so many points. And so that motivation, I think, for us has been one of the more powerful pieces.
So Abby, you're kind of in this interesting space in between entertainment and education, and it seems like there had to have been a lot of voices that went into some of these decisions. Can you talk a little bit about the stakeholders that were involved? How those all came together to combine into the decision to make an assessment?
Yeah, definitely. So the idea started with the Words with Friends studio and just a belief that this game could be a powerful tool in classrooms. And so we had that underpinning and that sort of blessing from the beginning. But the first thing we did was convene a working group of teachers. And before we had any learning goal, before we had any feature set, before we even had any idea of what the educational outcome would be of the game, we talked to teachers. We had Glass Lab in the room, and actually, I felt. I was trying to stay really neutral, that like this isn't necessarily a vocabulary game, and so I was trying to just kind of remove that from the table. But we heard it so loudly and clearly from that working group that it really led us in the direction that our feature set eventually took. And then the other thing we heard loudly from teachers was, you can't kill the fun. Like, if we're going to bring this game into the classroom, it needs to remain engaging. And that was actually a really great mandate to have, because it doesn't. What we heard from the teachers in the working group is we need to see some evidence, both up front and in our classrooms, that this game is authentically educational and that we can measure that in some way. And we need to see that it is more engaging for our students than other, more traditional educational tools. And that will give us the incentive or sort of the foundation to try out a kind of newer type of educational tool. So those were the pieces I held in my head the whole time.
Does that sound like a similar process for the other folks here?
Yeah, one of the interesting things is if we think about games in classrooms, teachers actually see less work from the students, less work product than like if they have a traditional piece of paper worksheet that the students has completed in front of them. So this idea of assessment and reporting is really about communicating to the teachers about what the students are doing in that game. So to me, it feels like if we're going to make games, there has to be some component where we're communicating to the teachers what the students are doing in the games.
I think the role of the teacher is something that's kind of neglected in a lot of games. Like, it doesn't even have to be just like seeing how they're doing, but they can be like part of the game in some way or part of that experience. What we strive to create in our games is that they're kind of guiding students through this experience. They're not determining the success or failure of their experience here, but they are able to see it really clearly what's happening, and then the game kind of gives them these views of the progress that's happening there. And they can kind of take a part in and act as a guide, act as the teacher in this space. So it's kind of beyond, I like to think beyond like evaluating what's going on there and actually kind of like playing that teaching role and like still having an impact. So it's that the game isn't necessarily, the worst case is if it tries to replace the teacher, tries to do what the teacher does, because you're not going to do better what the teacher does, but you can enhance what they're doing. And that's kind of what we try to do.
So John, oh yeah,
sorry,
go
just to
ahead.
piggyback on that.
Jump in.
It's, I think, seeing the game in the classroom environment, if it's a classroom game, is critical because there is a wide spectrum. Well, we saw a wide spectrum in the way that the role teachers played with the game in their classroom, and so and also the way that students played the game in the classroom. It's, if you think about Words with Friends, you're typically playing on your phone with an opponent who's not there. But if you're playing Words with Friends in the classroom, it's a much more sort of live, collaborative experience. Students are running from computer to computer, sort of pointing out words, helping each other out. We also saw teachers projecting their game board on the wall and calling out really great words that are played, or having a discussion around word origins. And so allowing the space for the teacher to use the tool in whatever way fits their style was important for us.
So John, I'm going to call you out as a representative of the little guy here,
Okay.
considering who you're up
Sure,
here
that's
with.
appropriate.
Yeah, you don't have maybe the research team behind you, or the full development power behind you that the other panelists do. Did that lead to any particular challenges or hurdles that you had to overcome? I know you spent a lot of time in the classroom working with teachers, but especially for the folks out here who might be in the same position.
For sure, definitely. I mean, we're our specialty is development. We're kind of a game development house. So the research side is something that we're familiar with, but we haven't. It's not our expertise. So typically, we partner with groups. We partner with UIUC for eco. We're talking about partnering with some other groups, but basically working with collaborators who have that kind of expertise has been really helpful, and kind of bringing in content experts and things like that. But yeah, basically finding people who are really interested in that space, and we can do what we do really well, and they complement that in a really good way.
What's your work style in those partnerships where you can kind of come together? Because I know I've seen some models, right, where it's almost like a contract out, where you give them a list of tasks and you get content back, but that seems challenging in a game environment.
Yeah, we like to have it more integrated, so they're part of all the development discussions, and we're part of the research discussions. I mean, with eco, research is something players do in the game, so that's kind of supplies the researchers as well, because there's so much data just being generated through the game itself. So there's a lot of kind of synergies and just overlaps there that work really well, that we can work closely together. We can, have this back and forth. They're using recent builds of the game. They're trying it out in classrooms. And given that it's a virtual world, it's something that can easily be distributed. We do a lot of testing remotely with teachers. Teachers who follow us on our Twitter or just social media are actually really interested in kind of, seeing what's next, seeing what's being done. And we found a lot of people are really wanting to help us out with that. So that's been a really great resource too.
Yeah, even though we're enormous, we actually don't have game design talent really in-house. So even for us, it's a partnership in trying to get that talent in. But in the games that I've worked on, it's really been kind of this triangle of the game designer, the learning content designer, and the assessment designer, and all push and pulling in making those design decisions. So that the game designer is saying, we need to do this to maintain engagement, and the learning designer says, but that goes against the principles of how students learn this concept, and the assessment person says, but that totally changes the difficulty you're asking them, which totally changes the inference we can make about their skills. So it's a lot of push and pull just between kind of those three kind of axes of the triangle, I think.
So I want to make sure to leave time for questions, which is a heads up to all of you to start thinking about questions. So I'm going to ask one more question, and it's a difficult question, so I'm not going to call one of you out in particular. Instead, I'll leave it up for whoever's brave enough to answer it. So the Department of Education is always interested in equity. And we've seen this is not new to game-based assessment, right? We know that there are equity issues with traditional assessments, everything from tests being, culturally biased, contextually biased, literacy factoring in. When you have a game-based assessment, it seems like it adds even more of those factors in, or at least different factors. So if one of you would be brave enough to tackle this question of biases, and how that's playing out in the game-based assessment world right now.
Yeah, I'll just say I don't have any answers to it, but think about this a lot. And for instance, when we make a game, it's not like, we get these statistics like 97% of kids are playing games. They're not all playing the same kinds of games. There's different people like different genres of games. And so if we're making a game-based assessment, it's just an adventure game or it's just a puzzle game, is that adding in another level of bias for different groups of people? I think part of it is thinking about getting information from lots of different sources. So it's not just the game telling you about this student's proficiency, but maybe it's multiple games. Maybe it's also how they're doing on other assignments, what they're doing in other digital places and non-digital places, teachers' ratings, and thinking about combining information across sources seems to me to be a potential way out, but we'll see.
Other thoughts?
I also in no way have the answer, but just one sort of angle is that we think a lot about the game as a way to demonstrate progression. And so rather than kind of a relative assessment, it's just about showing how a student is progressing as they play and removing it from the high stakes environment. I think, at least our game isn't meant to have the weight or the relative sort of value of other types of assessments. It's just meant to demonstrate progress.
I think there is some things that games can do better as far as equity is concerned because they can adapt themselves to the player. They can customize their difficulty or their experience to what type of learner they are. So if the game is detecting somebody's having like a difficult time on something, it can lower its difficulty, it can change its approach or things like that, which, compared to lecturing to a class of like 30 students, like you can't really give a different lecture per student, but a game can in that sense. So there's really interesting avenues, I think, that could actually really help that a lot. Another thing that I think is really interesting potential for equity is collaboration and connecting people socially through this game so that in our game, you have to collaborate to succeed. You kind of specialize in things and you trade with each other. So you can't really go it alone. And so you're compelled to bring other players into it, to help other people, to bring them up as well. And I think there's a lot games can do to kind of promote that positive social interaction and students kind of helping each other learn that I think can kind of help that equity as well.
So I love that. And so we'll put a pin in that for next year, and we can talk about game-based assessment in multiplayer environments and talk, I'm sure, that there is no collinearity between the data that comes in from that and other statistical issues. But that certainly sounds like a lot of fun to me. All right, so y'all had your warning. All right, you were listening. All right. First up, yeah. If you want to say who you are, too, before you ask.
Would you comment on the route of developing an educational game by taking a successful consumer game like SimCity or Civilization and moving that into ed versus creating an ed game from the ground up?
So we actually wrote a paper on this that compared modding to build from scratch. And I think it's a different set of challenges. The modding makes it more difficult for the assessment design and the learning design, because when you think about what's going to be the evidence you can get out, there's already a lot of that evidence is already defined. I'll say in making SimCity, a lot of those interactions were already there. There was this huge simulation engine that already existed that, modifying that actually turned out to be pretty difficult. But you already had the engagement. You already had this kind of known piece that you knew was going to be fun. Made from scratch, it's a little bit easier actually on the evidence side because and the learning side, because you can start from scratch on what kinds of data and evidence you're going to get. But it's a lot more challenging sometimes to really work in the fun and the engagement, and I think we've seen that in lots of educational games. So I think it's pick where you want your challenges to be.
And just to piggyback on that, I think it also varies depending on the sort of purely educational potential of the origin game if you choose to mod, and how closely you can align your educational outcomes with the core loop. So every game has kind of a small loop of actions that a player needs to take in order to succeed, and that kind of expands out through the game. And so it's really important if you're modding to attach your educational outcomes to that core loop. Otherwise, you've got two competing incentive structures for your players, and that's just a confusing experience.
I think that's a great point. That really depends a lot on the game. And I think it is kind of a danger area. It's the same Like if you take an educational product and you try to gamify it, you know, chocolate-covered broccoli is the term for that. And the inverse is, you know, a game and you put education on it can be broccoli-covered chocolate, basically. Like, which neither is very appetizing. But I mean, I don't think it has to be like that. And I think games like Civilization is probably my favorite educational game. And now it's finally like finding its ways in the classroom, which is awesome. So I think there's really appropriate uses of it. And it kind of, I feel like there's this false dichotomy between learning and fun. Like they are the same thing. That's kind of why things are fun, is because you're learning something. I mean, usually in a game, that's you're learning how to jump better in Mario or whatever. It's not academically useful, but it doesn't have to be that way. So I think there is a lot of value to considering that from the ground up, that they don't have to be separate. And if you consider them unified, you might get a better result.
I have to give a shout out to former OET director Richard Kulata yesterday for pointing out that you learn in every game, right? It's just a question of what you learn. So, all right, I think we're supposed to end now, but they started us late, so we're going to take one more. So I know you had your hand up first.
So games and assessment look at knowledge, facts, whatever, skills, which is a great thing for games. But have you guys had any experience with assessing or looking at dispositional changes from games? And any
What kind of changes, sorry?
disposition, like changing mindsets or motivation or thought process?
Yeah, that to me is this like the holy grail of like what I want to do with the games is, so I don't care if people memorize like what is the birth rate of elk in eco or whatever, like facts are less interesting. If you can change somebody's mind about science or their mind about how good they are at science or math, like that is transformational. And I think games have that potential because in a game, you know, you're expected to fail, it's expected to be difficult. How you assess that is really difficult. How do you measure that? I mean, is it a survey? Is it like a longitudinal study? That's something that I'm not really sure how that should be done, but I think if we could figure that out, we could show that games are just incredibly valuable.
So, so there's skills, there's also concepts and dispositions. So in terms of conceptual things, SimCity EDU is actually assessing systems thinking, how you understand systems and the impact of one part of a system on another. So that's certainly not a skill or a procedure, it's more of a conceptual understanding. In terms of dispositions, I've actually done some work building models of student persistence based on gameplay. I kind of did persistence first because it's kind of the easiest. If you think about how often do you keep trying after you fail versus giving up to do something else, that's certainly something that we can, I think about pretty easily in games, but is a disposition that's been shown, you know, certainly to be related to a lot of positive educational outcomes too.
And one of the, you know, in the working group of teachers that we worked with on this game, there was this you know, unbridled excitement and passion for language. And so I think games as a safe space to explore and fail and succeed and kind of find an identity in this virtual world, create a really rich opportunity for students to connect in a personal way to a subject that they might have felt distant from before. So in terms of long-term aspirations, that's something that we very much have in mind.
So last question, and we did a hand-raising thing with the audience, so I'll do one with the panelists too. How many of you are on Twitter or have a company on Twitter? All right. So these people are on Twitter. I'm on Twitter. We're out of time for this conversation, but please keep it going online. So hashtag G4C16 so that we can keep talking about assessment. This is kind of like assessment's only part in this conference, and it's a huge issue. So let's keep talking about it. I am going to retroactively allow you to make that plug. All right, thanks so much, everybody. We'll see you around the conference. We'll be up here for a little bit.
Thanks a lot.